Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Leaders Initiative seminar. My name is Stephanie, and I'll be monitoring things here on the back end. When it comes time for Q&As, feel free to either put your questions in the chat, or you are more than welcome to unmute yourself, and we can have a conversation as well. Towards the end of this talk, I will be sending out a Qualtrics evaluation. I will also send it in a follow-up email later on today. You can please join us for our next Leaders Initiative seminar. Our next Leaders Initiative seminar will be November 17th. We have Dr. Shruti Mishra will be presenting From Risk to Injury, Mechanistic Insights into Age and Vascular-Related White Matter Microstructural Impairments from Diffusion-Weighted MRI. That should be very interesting as well. And with that, I will turn things over for Courtney for the introduction.
Great. Thanks so much, Stephanie, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We're so excited to welcome Dr. Emily Briceño as our speaker for this month. Dr. Briceño is a clinical associate professor in the departments of physical medicine and rehabilitation and neurology. Her research focuses on cognitive assessment for the detection of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias across populations with culturally, linguistically, and socially varied contexts. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Briceño.
Great, thank you. I'm so happy to be here to present work from our team focused on measurement of cognition across these varied contexts. So before jumping in, I would just like to acknowledge the sources of funding that support the work I'll be presenting today. I'll be integrating data and insights from lots of different projects. And also to acknowledge the very deep and extensive team of collaborators that have contributed to this work. So I just asked ChatGPT to create a network map of the co-authors of the work from this presentation. And you can see it's a broad and very diverse team with regard to both disciplines and country of origin, et cetera. I think this work is really, it needs to be done within a multidisciplinary context and also a multicultural context. So I think that the insights from all of these contributors are really important to acknowledge. In addition to that, a lot of the insights on measurement have come from project staff across these different studies, and also our study participants. So just want to again, acknowledge and recognize all of the contributions of the people who've contributed to this work. The final thing I'll mention is I'll be presenting some unpublished kind of preliminary work in this talk. I was just kind of ready to do something new. So just wanted to mention that as well. So what I'm hoping to do today is first to present a rationale for why it's important and useful to study Alzheimer's disease and related dementias across different populations. Then I'll spend some time talking about how context influences the measurement of cognition. I'll start with more of a conceptual rationale, and then I'll show empirical evidence that supports that conceptual rationale. And then finally, I'll spend some time talking about work that we're doing internationally with the goal of advancing our measurement of cognition through this culturally centered cognitive assessment approach. All right, so to begin with, why should we study dementia across different populations? First, because of changes in our population, both in the US and globally, we know that our populations are aging rapidly. In the US, much of the growth is expected to occur in racial and ethnic minority populations, and globally, much of this growth will be coming from low and middle income countries. In contrast, most of what we know about dementia, including its risk factors, prevalence, impact, et cetera, come from high income countries and from racial and ethnic majority populations in the US. So we have this big gap, right, between what we know about dementia and what we need to know to be prepared for its growth globally. Also, so most of us are familiar with this figure from the Lancet Commission, right, that's shown up to 45% of the risk for dementia comes from potentially modifiable risk factors. So this is really important, right? Because a lot of our treatments for dementia have been elusive, and this can represent a really powerful way to reduce cases and prevent cases of dementia worldwide. But as the authors of the Lancet Commission write here, most of this evidence come from high-income countries. And so there may be critical insights about dementia and its causes and its impact that could come from broadening our study of this disease to include more parts of the world. And these insights, we expect to benefit all of us, both those of us residing in high-income countries and low and middle-income countries. So the HCAP, or the Harmonized Cognitive Assessment Protocol, was developed through the Health and Retirement Study and its international partner studies. And its goal was to create a cross-cultural instrument for measuring cognition and for detecting dementia in a comparable way across older adults globally. So this allows us to study dementia across varying contexts using comparable measurements, right? So it allows us to ask research questions that otherwise would be confounded by the approach to ADRD assessment. So my count right now is the HCAP has been implemented in about 19 countries. This map is definitely out of date. It's from a few months ago. But together, it offers a really exciting opportunity to study cognitive aging and to learn about dementia by including more of the world's population. So for those neuropsych nerds in the call like me, here is the HRS, the US-based version of the HCAP. So as you can see, it's a battery of about 90 minutes, and it includes a number of cognitive tests that are often used in neuropsych batteries to measure dementia. And it's designed to measure 5 cognitive domains, including orientation, memory, language, executive function, visual spatial functioning. So in order to implement that battery across other parts of the world, each study in the network has had to make necessary adaptations to the battery so that it's appropriate for the local language, culture, social, and educational context. And so these adaptations are super important and necessary, but they complicate our ability to directly compare scores across studies. So we came up with an approach to account for these differences and to still be able to create harmonized scores of cognition across these different contexts. What it involves in a nutshell is the first step is doing a really deep dive into the documentation and making note of administration, scoring, other kind of linguistic and cultural considerations, and making decisions about the degree of equivalence of these items across studies. We then take that information, and our statistical harmonization approach relies on the confirmatory factor analysis framework. And essentially what we do is we leverage all available information in each study, including those items that are common or we consider to be equivalent across studies, and items that we consider to be different. And we generate these co-calibrated cognitive domain scores to be used for cross-national research. So we were as rigorous as we could be when we harmonized our data. But what you can see here are the distributions of those harmonized cognitive test scores across 6 different national contexts. So the 2 that I've highlighted in yellow here, these are the general cognitive function scores in the 2 high-income country contexts, the US and England. And the distributions I've highlighted in green are data from low and middle income countries, so India, Mexico, China, and South Africa. So what you can see here is very different distributions in these harmonized test scores across different contexts. So what I hope to do in the rest of this talk is to describe and then show evidence for many of the different factors that could contribute to variability in these test scores that are not related to differences in true cognitive ability or underlying brain health. And I think these differences and these considerations are really important to address and understand so that we can really capitalize on these harmonized cross-national cognitive aging studies so that we can make accurate inferences about cognitive aging and dementia across varying contexts. Okay, so why does context matter when we're measuring cognition for dementia detection, right? So our ultimate goal of measuring cognition in this particular context, right, is to obtain a behavioral indicator of brain health. So ideally, we would like a high cognitive test score to indicate preserved brain health or the absence of ADRD, and we'd like a low cognitive test score. We ideally interpret that to mean changes in cognitive health or the presence of ADRD. So when there are factors that impact cognitive test scores but aren't related to brain health, this interferes with that goal. And further, like when these factors systematically vary across populations, it even more interferes with that goal. All right, so our field has standards for measuring cognition for any purpose. These are practice standards that were published by the American Psychological Association and 2 educational measurement associations. And there are a number of standards that apply to both accessibility and fairness that we're expected to abide by. And I just want to highlight a few of them here. So first is with regard to accessibility. So when we're measuring cognition, all test takers should have an unobstructed ability to demonstrate their standing on the construct that we're measuring. In terms of fairness, a test that is fair should reflect the same construct for all test takers. Scores should have the same meaning for all individuals across the intended study population. Fair tests do not advantage or disadvantage some individuals because of characteristics that are irrelevant to the intended construct. And then finally, to the degree possible, characteristics of all individuals in the intended study test population, including those pertaining to linguistic and cultural background, should be considered throughout the entire stages of development, administration, scoring, interpretation, and use, so that we can uncover and then remedy any barriers to fair assessment. All right, so in looking at the field of neuropsychology, historically, we have not yet met that standard. So this is work from Louis Medina and colleagues. And what they did is a systematic scoping review of all papers, or a representative set of papers published in the 7 primary neuropsychology journals between 2016 and 2019. And what they found was that more often than not, these contextual pieces of information, such as race, ethnicity, primary language use, acculturation, et cetera, were not reported in the study samples that were included in these journals. So what this shows is that we have a critical gap in how we as a field have routinely considered these factors when measuring cognition, right? And if we're not reporting the characteristics in our work, then we're not able to demonstrate that our tests meet those standards of fairness across the entire population that we're intending to use our tests for. Okay. So how does cultural, linguistic, and educational context relate to cognitive test performance? Again, it's important, I think, to remember that these neuropsychological tests that are most widely used have been developed in the US and have been studied primarily in non-Hispanic white monolingual populations with high levels of formal schooling. And so I'd like to show an example of why this matters, right? So one of our most widely used neuropsychological tests is the Boston naming test. It's a confrontation naming test that is sensitive to language changes that occur with the neurodegenerative processes that occur with Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. So as these semantic language networks begin to decline, the ability to name familiar objects also starts to decline. So we often use this as a measure that's sensitive to the decline that we often see in Alzheimer's disease. So one of the items on the Boston naming test developed in Boston, surprise, surprise, is this animal here. And so if you look on the map, you can see the areas of the world where this animal lives, right? So if you're like me, I'm a lifetime Michigander. I've seen this animal throughout my life, right? I've been exposed to it. It's been in my backyard. It's in my school's nature center. I've had lots of exposure throughout my life to this animal, and I've had all of those opportunities to become familiar with its name, right? But for people who live outside of this yellow area, it's very likely that the level of difficulty in naming this item is a lot higher, right? And that increased level of difficulty has nothing to do with your brain health or your cognitive function, and everything to do with your life experience. So this is an example of measurement bias, where there's difference in difficulty on a cognitive test item that's unrelated to difference in true cognitive ability. So just to quickly flip the perspective, this is an example of an animal, of a rodent that lives abundantly in other parts of the world, in the areas highlighted in red. So if you happen to be a person living in who's had a lot of life experience in one of those parts of the world, then naming this animal is going to be a lot more easy for you than if you live out in one of the green areas. And just for fun, some real life pictures of the capybara or chiguire. And so to summarize, right, conceptually, both cultural, social, linguistic, and educational context are really important to think about when we're considering cognitive test performance. Historically, the field of neuropsychology has not sufficiently considered these contexts in our evidence base. And yet we're expected to abide by these standards for test fairness. So I think that we have a lot of work to do. So what I'd like to do next is to show some evidence for measurement differences in our cognitive tests, particularly with the HCAP. I'm going to focus on subpopulations in the US for a couple of reasons. First, because this is work that I've done with my K, and we've done a lot of digging into these subpopulation differences here in the US. And second, because I think if I can show you measurement differences across US subpopulations, we can extrapolate that to hypothesize about what we might see across nationally. Okay, so one way to study measurement differences is to use these psychometric methods, and in particularly the study of differential item functioning. So the way that this works, we use confirmatory factor analysis, where we include a number of items that we believe measure the underlying ability level, in this example of memory. And so after we've used these items to create this latent ability score, what we would expect is after we've accounted for somebody's standing on the underlying latent ability level, their group membership should not be informative about their performance on an item within that construct. Again, after we've already accounted for where they stand on memory ability, we shouldn't get any more information about their performance on items at the group level. So we use this general framework to study differential item functioning in the HCAP across ethnicity and language. And so in order to do this, we started by harmonizing data using HCAP across the HRS HCAP study, which is again that nationally representative study of older adults in the US, and the basic cognitive study. Just briefly, the basic cognitive study is a community-based study of cognitive aging in South Texas. In the community there is about 50% Hispanic or Latino. And so it was designed prospectively to be harmonized with the HCAP. And when we harmonized the data, we were able to have an enriched sample of English and Spanish-speaking older adults across different ethnic groups. So we started with the confirmatory factor analysis model for the HCAP that was published by Rich Jones and colleagues. And we studied diff in each of these different domains But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to present the memory results, again, just to kind of simplify things and keep it moving. So what we found when we looked for differences in how these items performed across our 3 groups, we found differences in 5 of our 7 memory items. And I'm going to show you just 2 representative items to illustrate what those differences looked like. So first, you can see differences in the slope showing a stronger association between the item and the underlying ability level in the non-Hispanic white compared to both of our Hispanic or Latino groups. And in general, for most of the ability level, so what we're looking at here, the x-axis is showing the underlying memory ability score, and the y-axis is showing performance on the item itself. So just as an example here, for somebody whose estimated memory is at the mean, if you are a member of the non-Hispanic white group, your expected performance on the logical memory is higher than if you're a member of the Spanish-speaking Latino group. And we saw a similar pattern across each of our items here. So next, what we wanted to understand, right? So we saw these differences in how the items are measuring memory across groups. And next, we wanted to understand what's the impact of those item level measurement differences on the estimation of memory ability. So what we did is we calculated our memory scores using 2 different conditions. The first condition was ignoring all of the measurement differences. So we assumed equivalent parameters on all of our items across all of our groups, and we created a memory score. And then we created another version of the memory score that accounted for all of the group differences that we found in the item parameters. And we call that our diff-adjusted score. And what this plot is showing are the differences between our memory score that accounted for the memory difference, the measurement differences, and the version of the score that did not. And you can see for most of our Hispanic or Latino groups, our memory scores are being underestimated when we don't account for those measurement differences, excuse me. And this is occurring across most of the spectrum of the latent ability level. So again, in thinking about these results and applying them to our test standards, right? So we are expecting a test that is fair does not advantage or disadvantage some individuals because of characteristics irrelevant to the intended construct, right? And so what we're showing is that if we don't adjust for our memory differences, or for our measurement differences, excuse me, we run the risk of disadvantaging some people due to their group membership rather than due to their underlying ability level. So we use these same measures or methods to study items in the HCAP informant interview, which includes the IQ code. For those of you not familiar, the IQ code asks informants to rate the degree of cognitive change across a number of items. And the scale that they use ranges from much improved to a lot worse. So this is very preliminary, unpublished data, but sharing them now just for fun and to kind of link to what I'm going to show you next. So here, in contrast, we're showing measurement differences in only 3 of the 16 IQ code items. And this is a representative example here where most of the measurement difference that we're seeing, again, this is the estimated latent trait on the x-axis and the probability of answering an item in a particular way on the y-axis. And we're seeing that the measurement differences are really occurring on the range of this scale of the IQ code that pertains to cognitive improvement. And this is a range of the scale that we usually don't use for diagnostic purposes to classify impairment. And so it's a lot less worrisome about the potential for misclassification. And then just to plot those differences again and the impact of estimating overall cognitive change, We've got a few influential outliers that need some more investigation. Again, this is preliminary here, but what I want to highlight is that for most people in the range of the scale that we tend to use and create classification of cognitive impairment, we're seeing very little measurement differences across groups. Most of the measurement differences that we're seeing here for the Spanish-speaking participants is in that range of the scale that relates to cognitive improvement that we typically, again, don't use for classification. So then putting those two pieces of information together, another thing that we studied using these data was the association between our cognitive test scores with the HCAP and informant ratings of cognitive decline with the IQ code. And the idea here is that if our measurement is equivalent across groups, we should show similar associations between the cognitive test scores and how informants are rating cognitive decline. And what you can see in this figure here is that across all of our domains, we're seeing differences across groups, where in general, the cognitive test scores are more weakly related to informant-rated cognitive decline in our Hispanic or Latino older adults compared to the non-Hispanic white older adults. And particularly for this low end of the ability range, we're seeing that informants of non-Hispanic white older adults are reporting more cognitive change than informants of Latino older adults. So again, bringing this back to our standards, right? Our expectation is that our scores should have the same meaning for all individuals, and they should reflect the same construct for all test takers. And this data is providing evidence or suggesting that this may not fully be the case in this population. All right, so now hopefully I've shown some, again, conceptual rationale and empirical evidence for measurement differences across subpopulations in the US. And what I'd like to turn to now is the work that we're doing internationally in an effort to improve the way that we're measuring cognition across populations. And I'm going to present work that we've been doing in Nepal as part of the aging study of the Chitwan Valley Family Study. So just to briefly orient you all to this project, so this is a longitudinal study of cognitive aging and dementia in the Chitwan district of Nepal, which you can see on the map there. The project is led by Dirga Gamire here at U of M and Carlos Mendez de Leon at Georgetown University. I'm a co-investigator on the project, and my role is to focus on the adaptation of the HCAP there. The study population are the surviving cohort members of the Chitwan Valley Family Study who are now aged 50 and older. The CVFS is a longitudinal panel study that's been ongoing in the community for about 30 years. So we're using the HCAP to measure cognitive assessment and ultimately to classify dementia there. And our target sample size is a little bit over 3,000. So when thinking about adapting the HCAP for this study population, we started by looking at the characteristics of the eligible sample. And what you can see here is the study population reflects the Chitwan district and Nepal as a whole, in that it's very ethnically diverse. There is a caste system in Nepal, so these different ethnic groups relate to very substantial social inequality and also very different cultural practices. Also, you can see because of historically structural barriers to access to education, nearly half of our eligible study sample has had no access to formal school. So when thinking about our approach to adaptation, we needed to really make sure that our assessment is appropriate across all subpopulations and across a very wide spectrum of education. The next thing we did to prepare for adapting the HCAP in Nepal is to consult the literature. And what we found is that there were very few studies of cognitive aging and dementia in Nepal. Those that were published primarily used the MMSE to measure cognition, but there were no references for a validation study of the MMSE in Nepal or any sort of normative data to inform a clinical cut score. So we really didn't have an infrastructure to draw on when creating an assessment tool specifically for the Nepal context. All right, so we developed a plan to adapt the HCAP. And again, our goal was really to learn from and draw from the local expertise in the community. So we started by assembling a multidisciplinary local expert team, and I'll describe that more in a moment. We then took the India's version of the HCAP from the Lassi Dodd study, and we translated that into Nepali. We chose that, of course, because of the geographic and social and cultural similarities to the Nepal context. In collaboration with our expert team, we then did a number of focus groups to get some feedback on that initial translation. We made some adaptations based on that feedback, and then we tested those adaptations with cognitive interviewing, and I'll describe that in a minute. And then our last step was to do pilot testing in a sample of about 150 older adults. So again, as we were developing our adaptation approach, it was important to us to design it in a way that made sure that all subpopulations that were part of our target sample would be included throughout the process. So we were lucky with this particular project to draw on the infrastructure of a very long-standing panel study in Chitwan. And so we were able to include clinicians in our team. We had a neurologist and a geriatrician and two psychiatrists. We also had a sociologist and an anthropologist who provided expertise in the social and cultural context locally. And we also had experts in public health. And so with that team, we did cognitive interviewing, which is kind of an unfortunate term in this context, but it's a qualitative approach that's often used in survey development. And the goal of cognitive interviewing is to get feedback on the instrument that we're intending to use. We want to understand how the respondent's understanding, interpreting, and approaching questions so that we can uncover any barriers in accessibility or familiarity and then address them. This is usually done with very small and purposeful samples. And so in this particular study, we oversampled our ethnic minority groups and individuals with no formal education, so we could really get feedback about how the tool was working. And then what we do is we transcribe the interviews, and then we do a qualitative analysis of the responses so that we can learn from the participants. And so I'm going to share a few highlights of what we've learned from the cognitive interviewing. So first, to measure visual spatial construction and recall, the HCAP instrument in both the US and also in India used the CRAD constructional praxis. For those of you not familiar, it just involves copying a series of shapes with paper and pencil and then recalling them later. And so what we learned from our participants is that most of them declined to attempt this test. And these are some representative quotes. Essentially, using a paper and pencil and drawing shapes was an activity that was just not familiar, not something that they've had life experience with. And so it represented a barrier to showing their standing on the construct, right? So again, with accessibility, our goal is that all test takers have an unobstructed opportunity to demonstrate their standing on the construct, right? So our goal is to measure visual spatial ability and visual recall. Our goal is not to measure school, drawing skills that were learned in school. And so by using this format of asking people to use paper and pencil to show their visual spatial ability, we're providing a barrier to access for many of our older adults who don't have life experience with that modality. So what we did, we consulted with our colleagues from South Africa who had used an adaptation from a Nigerian team, which uses matchsticks. So rather than having participants use a paper and pencil to draw these shapes, instead they're copying figures using matchsticks. And what we found in our pilot sample when we administered both the CRAD constructional praxis and our matchstick test is we had much fewer observations of zero or missing on our items. So we're really improving the floor effects that we were seeing in our paper and pencil version. We also saw a similar pattern with the recall. We still are seeing, even with the matchsticks, a number of zero or missing scores, but it's much improved compared to the CRAD. And so work that we have ongoing is to do some further validation of this this item to further study its construct validity and its diagnostic validity. Another challenge we found in cognitive interviewing was the method to measure speeded visual attention. The HCAP, the reference HCAP that we used had a symbol cancellation test where participants were asked to identify these target symbols and then use a pen to draw a circle around the target symbol as quickly as they could. And so feedback from cognitive interviewing, we learned again, similarly to the constructional praxis, that using a paper and pencil was a barrier. The act of drawing a circle around a stimulus was a barrier, not something that our participants had life experience with. And the size of the stimuli were also noted to be a barrier. They noted trouble seeing the stimuli. So we came up with an adaptation here that replicates the structure of the symbol cancellation test, but instead of identifying target symbols using a paper and pencil, they're identifying target beans. And this is something that all of our participants have life experience with and are very used to doing. And so again, we're doing work now to look at our preliminary data and to study its construct validity, but what we're seeing thus far is very encouraging with very little missing data. And so then now moving forward, in this paper, we assembled a team of HCAP researchers from around the world who have done work on HCAP adaptation across 10 countries around the world. And what we did was we integrated all of our experiences in doing this HCAP adaptation work, especially in settings that don't have an established infrastructure for cognitive assessment. And then we integrated our experiences with available guidelines on adapting both neuropsychological tests and adapting survey instruments. And so what we advocate for in this paper is really moving to a construct-centered approach to adaptation, where we're starting with the construct that we intend to measure, and then we move forward and we look for evidence for or against construct validity. And then we make adaptations or develop a new item as needed to ensure that we're measuring this construct appropriately within the context that we hope to. We also advocate again for having this work really being guided by a local multidisciplinary expert team so that the cultural, social, linguistic, and educational context is represented throughout the adaptation process. And then we advocate that we should use rigorous methods to adapt the HCAP in a new context. And when we find violations of construct validity, we should work to remedy them. And if we have conflict between local construct validity and harmonization needs, we should prioritize always validity in the local context. And then finally, I think that the HCAP network offers a really exciting opportunity to expand our evidence base, not only in cognitive aging and in dementia, but also advance the science of neuropsychology. Our teams are creating data on cognition in places of the world that it didn't previously exist. And our teams are innovating and adapting And so this is a really exciting opportunity to expand neuropsychology, expand our science, and also to work towards construct validation. So as our teams are innovating and adapting new items, the next step is to build evidence of construct validity. And so I think that this can be done through building what we call a nomological network, which means integrating various sources of evidence about the validity of our tools, piece by piece, with various types of data. So I give just some examples here. So one piece of data would be predicting an external criterion equivalently across contexts. We might see equivalent alignment with informant-rated or clinician-rated impairment, or association with ADRD biomarkers. And any one of these points of information is insufficient to conclude construct validity, but taken together and building over time, we can not only build evidence of construct validity, but we can also learn from each of these pieces of information to improve the way that we're measuring cognition and to expand the science of neuropsychology. All right, so that's what I've got. I hope I've left time for questions. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily. That was a great talk. Yes, please unmute yourself, ask questions. There were a couple comments in the chat about the beaver. Yeah, many of us have never actually seen a beaver in real life, even if we've lived here our whole life. I've seen them on a little camera at the zoo. That's about it.
Great feedback. It goes to show. Lots of lack of beaver experience. Any other questions, comments?
Emily, this is Erwin Vega. Hi, how are you?
Hi, good. How are you?
Great work, as always. Really glad that you're working on this. And I don't know if it's a question of a comment, but we have used, and I'm guilty of it, of using the terms race and ethnicity in our research. And sometimes we imply other factors and as a proxy for many contexts, and we haven't really defined that when we actually use it in the past. And now with lately I've been questioning myself about what is what other contextual factors we need to actually pay attention, that we took for granted the definition of race and ethnicity that what implies in the groups that we study, but actually look at a, not only education is another issue as well, but defining what are those the contextual factors that contribute to the changes that we see. So when you are harmonizing this and defining the groups, what kind of information are you collecting from your cohorts? What type of questions that can be used to harmonize or to find characteristics in these different cohorts that you are studying, or have read about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, for one thing, when we do, we're grappling with this issue with one of our projects now, where we're doing some cross-national analyses. And thus far, we're actually not using our harmonized cognitive test scores, and instead we're creating parallel models. One of the reasons for that is because the meaning of race ethnicity in the US can't be harmonized with the meaning of race ethnicity in Nepal, for example, right? They're just two different things, with two different, it's proxying for very different things. And so that's one thing that we try not to do in our cross-national work, is to harmonize, or to attempt to harmonize that variable. And instead, what we do is we run parallel models within each country that allows for us to define these things differently. And in terms of other contextual information, I really agree with you. and what we measure and study, it varies across these different contexts. But yeah, and I think that's really where we're going to gain insights, right? Rather than thinking about these groups as monolithic, is really understanding how they're different and how their exposures are different.
And actually capturing their experiences through their lifespans, like experiences that promote resiliency, experiences that promote coping with aspects, which actually leads to resilience, and trauma that actually does the opposite. So experiences is actually another difficult factor to account in these groups that we are studying as well, because what can be perceived as a trauma in one group might not be in another because of the other factors around in that social group, right? That can help them cope better than in other structures. So it's a very complicated contextual factors too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And thinking about that as it applies to measurement, it reminds me, so we're doing some work now in Guatemala with one of the indigenous languages there. And we found that one of the stories from the HCAP, because of the history of collective trauma in that community, it was a story about a robbery. And our local partner said, like, this is not a good story to use in this particular population because of that, because it's going to bring up, you know, the collective trauma that's been experienced there. And so we changed it. It's not about a robbery anymore. It's about somebody who finds some money and delivers it to the person who needs it. And so, yeah, it's also a great example.
Thank you. Great work.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Any other questions before we finish up for the day? Oh, Voiko has a question.
Yeah, I am just curious, the role of language, different languages in all these harmonization processes. How big an effect are the differences between different kind of families of languages?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it depends on the study. We have studied this a little bit in the US across English and Spanish, right? And we are seeing some measurement differences across English and Spanish. I think that, you know, they can be tricky to study because language differences can also, you know, kind of like Irving was mentioning, they can also reflect other differences, right? So cultural differences, geographic differences. I'm thinking about India, for example. And so I think the answer is we don't know yet how important, but we are working on it. And I think it's a really fascinating question.
I have a question. I was wondering what your thoughts were about like bilingualism and how that very much so like varies across the US in terms of like families like acculturation, and things like that, and how that might influence scores that we see. Because I know some research shows that bilingualism is very much helpful and protective, while other research shows that like bilingualism can actually like impact language skills in like a given task. So I was wondering what your thoughts were about that.
Yeah, it's another fascinating topic that can be a whole career's worth of study, right? We've done a little bit of work using the MOCA across English and Spanish. And also we've studied bilingual animal naming in the HCAP. And so I think the answer also really depends on the context, right? It depends on so many bilingualism factors. Which languages are you bilingual in? Why are you bilingual? How did you acquire your languages? In what way do you use your two languages? Are you doing a lot of switching day to day? Are you really separating? I think all of those things likely matter and really depend on the context. So as it pertains to measurement, I have a lot of questions and interests about it, right? And one of the simple ones is just for people who are bilingual, how are we ensuring that we're assessing them in their best language? A lot of times for survey research, right? Most people don't have experience with cognitive assessment, right? So making that decision about which language to be assessed in, it's usually not a decision that's informed by experience, right? And so the level of proficiency that you might need for a survey is very different from the level of proficiency that would be needed to really best capture your optimal cognitive ability, right? And so I think typically what's done is that people are just offered a choice. They're asked which language they want to use. And so it is possible that that we're making some mistakes in measuring cognition among people who are bilingual and not tested in their optimal language. But just a hypothesis.
Thanks, Dr. Briceño. I appreciated your presentation. And actually, that's where my question was coming from. It's rooted from populations that are not English or Spanish-speaking languages. And part of my experience is just recognizing that in different regions of the United States, there are people that just don't have experiences with the exposures that we're presenting them. And so I appreciate that your presentation just took that into account with different language groups, even those that you haven't considered. That's it.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. You're right. Even in the US, right, there is a lot of linguistic diversity beyond just English and Spanish. And right now, the HCAP is offered in English or Spanish. And so, yeah, I think that's a great point.
All right, if there aren't any other questions or comments, I think we'll call it a day. Please make sure you fill out the evaluation, and I will be sending a follow-up email later on today. Thank you so much, Emily. That was a great talk, and we're very happy to have you.
Thank you so much. And please share my postdoc listing with everyone you know.
Absolutely.
All right, thanks for coming, everybody. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.